Welcome back to the TBR Podcast. We're your hosts.
I'm Kelsey.
And I'm Bree.
And today we have a very special guest, our resident Hunger Games expert, Miss Lucky.
Hello. Thank you for having me on.
Yes,
Absolutely.
we're so excited to have you.
I know if you want any other deep dives into your other favorite worlds, Lucky is also expert on those as well.
So
We'll link all her information, TikTok, YouTube, everything down below. So check that out. And then
so
today's video. Today we're going to go into a little Hunger Games debrief in anticipation for the release of Sunrise on the Reaping.
So excited. So
Yes.
we're breaking this up into part 1, part 2. So here, part 1, we're just going to be talking about the political commentary that we see in Suzanne Collins' books and how that's going to affect what we're going to see in Sunrise.
Right.
Part 2, we're really going to go deep into Sunrise, what our theories are, what we hope to see, and all that
Connection.
good stuff. So make sure that you are subscribed, have that notification bell on so you don't miss that episode.
No, please go on. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, girl.
We interrupt.
This is how we do it. So
All right. We're going to put you on the spot. Miss Lucky.
Okay,
Lucky.
I'm ready.
Okay.
I'm ready.
So we know you are the Hunger Games expert.
Well, that's very high flattery. I'd argue there's quite a few others. Thank you. I do appreciate that.
So I know that you got a lot of your TikTok fame from doing, the deep dives into Hunger Games. Why did you choose the Hunger Games to do your whole little deep dive on that?
Well, to be totally frank, I had just rewatched the movies, not for the first time, but for the first time with my younger sister. And I'm the sort that pauses every 10 to 15 minutes and goes on long-winded tangents. And I was like, actually, maybe I should preserve her movie experience and post these online. The usual format of my content is I finish a TV show, I finish a movie, and then I just talk about everything that I want to talk about it associated with that, franchise or have not. But when I started doing the Hunger Games, I had the Q&A feature available and people were really spamming that section. And I love Q&A format style commentary. I find it very easy. It's like bite-sized mini essays. Yeah. So I had a great time engaging with that. There were so many wonderful, thoughtful questions asked. And it was a fun wave to ride for about 2 to 3 months. And every 2 to 3 months now, it kind of resurges and I go and perhaps a bit longer now that Sunrise on the Reaping is about to release. I feel like there's more much to dissect.
Yeah. It's March 18th that it comes out, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I believe so. I hope so. If I'm wrong,
I pre-ordered it.
Yeah. So it should be coming out. Are you going to do a deep dive on Sunrise once the book comes out? Or are you going to wait till the movies or do both?
I think I'm going to take at least a week to sit with the book before I start delving into any deep dives. I want to read it at least twice before I begin. But I do have several quiet theories as to what could potentially take place that I'm very excited to explore. And I'll probably get all those out the week before release.
Love it.
I can't wait. Yes. Okay. Well.
Okay. So, talking about the Hunger Games as a franchise itself, I feel like these books are already classics. Would you agree?
I would agree. Children read them in schools. I've gotten a handful of extremely funny comments where English teachers will point out that they notice that their students are citing my videos in their essays, which I think is hilarious.
I love that.
No, that's how you know you've made it.
Oh my God.
No, it's hysterical. I love it. And I think that once you get to the point where you're being broken down in freshman English class, I think that means that you're a modern classic,
Yes, absolutely. Do you think it's going to be a banned book?
Isn't it already a banned book?
Is it already?
It's been a banned book since its release, actually. I believe Yeah.
Because of the political commentary.
Yeah.
Yes, because of the political commentary. The reason that it's banned, the cited reason is usually the violence towards children, but the violence in of itself isn't heavily detailed in the books for the most part.
Right.
One exception is the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and that does go into some more excessive detail. But the original trilogy is pretty cut and clean with it.
Yeah.
Doesn't focus on it, doesn't go into elaborate detail. So definitely the political commentary.
Yeah.
No, right.
Really trying to say. So, okay, going into the original trilogy of the Hunger Games, we know that Suzanne Collins was inspired by the war that was going on in Iraq at the time and flipping through channels, switching between that coverage, and then also looking at with these game show,
the reality
TV shows.
Yeah.
And she was inspired by that to be like, oh, like war.
That's so like,
yeah,
to go from war to just trashy television, how they say.
Right.
Yeah.
And then like, I know she was writing her other series, the Under something. Oh my gosh. What is it
Gregor the Overlander, I believe.
Yes.
Yes.
You know.
See? Expert.
I know, expert. Which I haven't read yet. You haven't read that yet. Have you read that?
I read the first 2 books when I was, I believe, in middle school, so don't ask me to recall it.
No.
Right now, I'm actually terrified that it's Gregor the Underlander, and I said it wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's Gregor the Overlander.
Look,
it's about...
Don't we have...
somewhere. I think it's Overlander. That looks right.
The super crude summary is that it's like, I don't know how old he is. I want to say 12. 12-year-old boy finds kingdom of like magical rats.
Slay.
Extremely crude summary. But I remember them being excellently written. And what I think is so funny about that series is that Suzanne Collins got her start in writing with children's television.
Yes. The bear with the moon.
Little Bear. She did Little Bear. She did one of my personal favorites, Clifford's Puppy Days. That went platinum in my household. Many standing ovations from my living room. I believe she also was one of the co-writers on Wow Wow Wubsy, which I think is hysterical, actually.
No, she had a start.
Yeah. Plus, like, she knows then television. Mm-hmm. She knows, all the background with kids, whatever. So she's like able to take that and make. So didn't she also write or was on the writing team for the movies as well?
I believe so, for the majority of them, that she was either a consultant, but I think for Ballad she wrote part of the script. I'm not 100% sure on that fact, though.
Yeah.
I believe that she is heavily involved in the script writing process.
Yeah.
I think for the first Hunger Games as well, she was helping like write the main script for that as well.
So I just think it's cool that she has that background in television, which I know it's, children's, but like still have that background there. And then also writer being able to, combine the two for her movies and stuff. So I know like you're going to get a good interpretation of the book,
Yeah. She also studied acting a little bit too.
God, she does it all.
Yeah, like she knew how to sword fight and stuff, which I'm sure translates really well into these.
Yeah.
So
no, that's a very well prepared woman right there.
Yeah. And she's a theater girl, and so like I'm a theater girl, so
and locked in
her.
I did not know the sword fighting fact.
I like saw that and I was like, that's such a slay.
Yeah.
She does archery.
Right.
She bakes.
She does bake. Yeah.
She decorates art.
She does it all.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh my gosh.
Well, no, that was just for you.
Oh, okay. I thought we were going into it.
No, absolutely not.
So, okay. So we're talking a little bit about the political message, the banned book and all.
Yeah.
So what would you say, you looked it up, like specifically the messages in Hunger Games, the political.
Let me pull it up real quick.
And Lucky, if you want to jump in here, feel free. I know you probably have it all listed out in your brain.
Like, is the prompt list the main political messages of the Hunger Games or the political messages we thought got the series banned?
Ooh, both.
Ooh, both.
Both.
I think a lot of the symbolic violence is, like, I think that contributes extremely heavily to why the series is so heavily targeted and picked on. Because it truly is the only language the oppressor speaks. Yeah. So I think to have a series that forces young adolescents to confront that and to actually register the implications behind what they're seeing, that encourages them to not be desensitized in a world that relentlessly bombards you with violent imagery. I think that to an oppressive regime is quite dangerous. So I think that definitely contributes to why somebody wouldn't theoretically want children to have ready access to it.
Yes, absolutely. So I just looked it up here, and basically it's, kind of on the same lines, like it explores themes of inequality, oppression, the dangers of authoritarianism.
Yes,
Authoritarianism.
It's a fun word.
Yeah, so I think it hits kind of like those main, like I feel like for Hunger Games, it hits like, those main themes, inequality, just control and how dangerous that can be and all of that. And I know in the other books, it kind of goes, I feel like in a slightly more specific manner. But I know obviously the inequalities from, the wealthy versus the poor, the oppression from, it's like a dictatorship, oppressing the districts. Also how you were saying the dehumanization, but also the desensitization to violence.
Yes.
And then obviously the importance of democracy, because the dangers of getting too much power to the few and how that's emphasized. So yeah, it's like a heavy focus on, I think it goes over like that general umbrella first.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think, like you were saying, Lucky, like it is made for a younger audience to be able to kind of have an introduction into these.
Like an easier way to consume that too.
Absolutely. And I have a quote here that Collins had said. She said, quote, "It's crucial that young readers are considering scenarios about humanity's future because the challenges are about to land in their laps. I hope they question how elements of the books might be relevant to their own lives, about global warming, about mistreatment of the environment, but also questions like, how do you feel about the fact that some people take their next meal for granted when so many other people are starving in the world?" End quote.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, Miss Suzanne just knows how to use her words.
Absolutely.
Like that really sums it up.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And then, oh, please.
Oh, go on. No, please go on.
No, please.
No, you please.
I was going to say that I think also just the critiques of overconsumption are another big thing that tends to get this series sort of picked on, The big one that comes to mind is the party scene in Catching Fire, where they discover that the citizens of the Capitol take I don't remember the word for this, but essentially pills that allow them to throw up so they can continue gorging themselves. Just that needless, mindless excess consumption for the sake of consuming. And I think it really causes young readers to evaluate what they consume and why they need those things in the first place.
Yeah.
Because then you see that in that same, not same scene, but then you see, oh, we're throwing up to eat more. But then you flash back to, District 12 where they're, starving. So seeing that heavy contrast between the two, I think it's like, oh, I got to take a look in my life and how I'm seeing that too. Because it really shows a light on like America too. And just,
Yeah. And I think on top of that as well, like that's a very blatant, like literally consuming and taking for granted that. But I think also within the world of Hunger Games, it's the entertainment that they're consuming, and they're literally watching children kill each other as entertainment. And that's the Capitol's choice to to consume that. It's not the rest of the districts. Like they are forced to watch this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. They kind of make a whole like show out of it, obviously.
Yeah.
How they're like, oh, crying when they're doing the interviews and like, oh, laughing and, the whole talk show type thing, which is so crazy. Like to think about, because like how we're watching TV and if we see, things in the news and whatever, and we're watching it just as a show, if it's in reality or not. And then boom, we can turn it off and go back to our normal lives. And then it's the same way that the people in the Capitol and everyone are doing too, just watching it as for entertainment. So it's just, it really makes you think. It really makes you think about like my place.
Right. And what I love right now is Love is Blind. Do you watch that show at all?
Yes, I do. I do unfortunately watch
Right? Are you pretty caught up on the new season so far?
I haven't started watching yet. The entire family needs to be here before we begin. It's like a house rule.
Okay. Can I give a little?
You are allowed to spoil all of it. I truly do not mind.
Okay. Well, I just think it's interesting because again, this is reality TV that's very popular at the moment. That has some problems in the background with the way that they're treating the contestants and everything. But beside that, this season particularly, we have this young woman, I think her name is Sarah, and she comes in with very deep questions about politics and ethics and my sister, she's gay, and how would you react to that? Like, are you LGBTQ plus friendly?
And also like BLM, Black Lives Matter, like that's a huge thing to me,
And like, are you more liberal, conservative? Like, she's the only one so far that's really deep dived and continued to talk about it and have deep conversations with the person that she's talking to. And it's like throughout the whole season.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to hear, one, what like she's saying, and also how her partner's responding, and then how her family is responding, and then how the audience is responding.
Yeah.
Because it just gives me this, like, we're watching this reality TV show
just for funsies. And,
But then here we have someone bringing up, like, oh, yeah, they're like politics, like, that's a big thing happening right now. And like all the time, but like, And then I think of Hunger Games. Okay, they're watching Hunger Games. And then this girl, Katniss, what's she doing with like the 3 fingers? And she's burying Rue. And like this romance and stuff. Like, she's the symbol that's bringing to light some questions and putting the fire underneath the districts to rebel.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I just saw that connection there. And I thought it was
because also like opening the eyes to people, obviously, the upper districts, they're obviously see it as more just entertainment. So when you see someone like Katniss, doing the 3 fingers, burying Rue, like doing all of these things that shows like these are the actual, I mean, mind you, we're all killing each other, but like it's kind of pulling you out of that because they were so desensitized to that. So like pulling you out of that and showing you like the ethics behind it. So like same thing, Love is Blind, you're watching for funsies, but then you're like, oh, you're really, telling me to think about this right now. So I can see that parallel there for sure.
Yeah.
I think
that was interesting.
I think what stands out the most to me about the reality TV connection, especially like reality TV as inspiration, is that the series focuses so heavily on the idea of like the commodification of the body. And what better example do you have in your day-to-day life of the commodification of the body than reality television? And I feel people would respond kind of hostilely to that statement because they'd be like, oh, they're there of their own free will. Nobody dragged them and forced them onto Love is Blind. But there's, like, setting aside shows like Love is Blind, there are so many reality TV shows where the contestants are saying things along the lines of, oh, I'm hoping to win to pay for my tuition or to help purchase my family a house or to pay for my sister's cancer treatment. And you're watching these people compete for your entertainment, for the things that are necessary to sustain their life, the bare essentials. So I feel that's a very powerful example of that. And I think I'm rambling a little bit, but
please.
One of the things that I love about the way the series approaches this idea is that it repeatedly demonstrates at every possible opportunity that nobody in Panem actually has authority over their own body. That's considered the most basic human right, but it's considered a privilege. The Capitol, like that privilege is something the Capitol has the ability to revoke at any given point in time. The worst punishment they can give you is literally the removal of your tongue.
Yes.
And the main way they spread like political propaganda is through the desecration of the body. Just constantly reinforcing this message that you don't actually have access to the one thing that should theoretically always be yours.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I know, I feel like there's like an interesting overlap there.
Heavy overlap for
Absolutely. And going off the idea of like the body and stuff, you have these extreme, what is it called? Extreme
like body modifications.
Yeah, body modifications in Panem. How do you think like that relates to that idea of like the body being, a commodity?
Yes, I think in terms of the way that I feel like the fashion of the Capitol is very often reduced to a very flippant, fashion is bad. And I don't think that's what Suzanne Collins is trying to say at all.
Yeah.
The citizens of the Capitol are very heavily restricted in the ways they are able to express themselves socially, in the ways they are able to express themselves politically. There are extremely rigid class hierarchies. And so, and it's also implied that the majority of Capitol citizens are not financially well off. This is a very heavily explored, but there's a lot of subtext, especially in Mockingjay, that suggests that just because you're in the Capitol doesn't mean you're actually the 1% of the Capitol. So I think the reason that you see such excessive body modification, such like extravagant expression of self is because that is really the only true outlet the majority of Capitol citizenry have to feel they have some form of authentic control over themselves. And it does work because I mean, if they are under the impression that if they have the ability to alter themselves so radically, surely they must be free. It's kind of like the freedom of choice when consuming. You're like, oh, I have access to 50 different kinds of potato chips. This is truly the land of opportunity. Like a similar vein of logic.
Yeah, but like the same thing. Like I feel like they're also. I got to make sure like people also don't see me as like poor or that I'm lacking something. So I got to, fluff myself up, do everything to show, the people around me that like, no, I deserve to be in, District 1 and I'm 1%. Like, look how.
Or in Pan Am.
In Pan Am, yeah. Like I'm, look how extravagant I look, So it's like, you can see how just that spectrum on there.
And we can see that in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes with how Snow has to present himself because his family is quite poor at the beginning of that and throughout most of the book. And, he has Tigress who's like sewing up his best clothes, making them look better again. And she's like taking the scraps from her job that, she's interning or assisting the fashion person there. And
it's so important for them to know, like, we're not poor. We're well off. We're not poor, I promise.
Right. And like him being so selective when there's the food, at the banquet and stuff. And he's only taking a little bit so he doesn't look like he needs to have food, right? Even though he's essentially starving, right?
Yeah. Got to keep up appearances.
Of course. And what I think is very interesting about the body modifications of the original trilogy is that they describe like very outlandish otherworldly things like dyed skin, like extreme like tattooing of the body. But there is this invisible line because Tigress is described as being a person that crosses it, somebody that goes too far, somebody that is reviled because they go too far. And my personal theory, my personal little pet theory about this is that the reason that they push these sort of like aesthetic extremes is to separate themselves from people of the districts, to separate themselves from what they consider to be the default human being, something higher, something ethereal, something that no member of the district would ever be able to fully emulate. And the reason that Tigress is ostracized is because she doesn't elevate herself. She desecrates herself. She alters herself to look animal. She lowering herself below the status of a human being. So that's always been kind of like my internal logic as to why she's rejected, despite her appearance, honestly, in comparison to some of the descriptions of the books, not being that extreme, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So I have a question going off of that, because we look at the victors in the past, and like, yes, they're not obviously to the level of Pan Am and the citizens of Pan Am, but they are seen as icons for a lot of the people there. And the only modification that I'm remembering is Annabara, but she did that going into her games.
Yeah.
So I don't remember any other victor, though, having any modification to their body, at least not to the extreme.
Or for like specifically for the games.
Yeah. And do we think that has a purpose? Like, do we think that the capital, or Snow specifically is like, yeah, you can't, like, you have to stay below us still because you're not one of us?
I think so. When it comes to the alteration of the victors, Enobaria is the only one that's like described in that level of detail. But it happens after her first games.
Oh, it did.
So I think that if I'm remembering the line correctly, I suppose you could interpret like Haymitch's statement, oh, she had them filed down to tear out people's throats, as her doing that in a panic after being reaped and catching fire. But personally, I've always interpreted it as she had them filed after her games. The consent of this obviously being extremely dubious. One thing I do remember from the books, there's a line that alludes to the capital wanting to give Katniss breast implants.
Yes.
And but whether or not they do that to all female victors is questionable. But one thing they do for sure is that they attempt to remove all physical signs of harm. So they try to remove burns, they try to remove scars, anything that would physically indicate the trauma of what they've been to. Obviously, there's things they cannot do. They cannot save Peeta's legs, so they give him a prosthetic. And they presumably do the same with other victors. But one thing that kind of stands out to me in Catching Fire is that a lot of the victors don't wear their prosthetics.
Yes, I was thinking of Chaff.
Yes.
Right? Because he's missing his hand.
Yes. And I'm not sure. I'll have to reread this passage because I'm not sure if it's like, oh, they're broken, they're worn with time, but I've always interpreted that as like a small act of rebellion to show that you
1,000%.
cannot hide what was actually done to me.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think that's a kind of very interesting way of going about it. Obviously, they have limitations, but whatever they can do to express the reality of what they experience, they do lean into
Yeah.
fully.
Because I know, like, the people going to the games, like, oh, you know, we'll clean them up, make them look as perfect as
Yes.
possible so they don't show, like, the traumas and whatever they've been through. So when you're watching the show, you're like, oh, okay, it's just a fun little games and whatever. So I do like how, yeah, the smallest thing they could do is like, oh, I'm not going to wear the prosthetic. I'm not going to, you know, do this or that to show, like, yeah, I've been through this. Look, have trauma from it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I love that little act of rebellion. Like, oh,
Yeah.
so good.
And I mean, we see like the act of rebellion as well in Catching Fire with all the victors who've been reaped again, because the way that they're talking in their interviews, they're, you know, they have their different techniques and stuff or tactics of trying to be like, oh, my brother, my sister,
Mhm.
or like, oh, like, you want to see us go into the games again? I don't think they do. Like, and the baby, the classic
Yes.
Peeta line, and the baby.
Yes.
So, like, that's also, you could say, a form of rebellion, because they're like, don't put us in there again.
Yeah. Yeah, especially with Johanna, where she was like,
But that was different from the book versus the movie, because the movie was her yelling and screaming, but the book was her talking and like pleading with the audience specifically, right?
Yeah.
Am I remembering that right?
I believe so. I think I feel like Joanna's ever so very slightly flanderized in the movie, although I love her actress's performance.
Yeah.
But the movie does very heavily exaggerate the extremes of her anger. So I feel in a lot of people's heads, Joanna manifests as this sort of like belligerent, frothing at the mouth, enraged character.
yeah.
She is a very angry person, but the way she chooses to express her anger is usually very strategic, in my opinion. At least from what I'm
Yeah.
remembering.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, absolutely. I know it's been a minute since I've read the books.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, going into like the movies versus the books as well, and how I think each of them does help like bring to light this political conversation in their own ways. Because the book, I think you get the internal monologue, especially in Mockingjay.
Yeah.
Of Katniss, and I mean, there's a whole part of the book where she's not speaking to anybody, and all you get is the internal, and the fact that this is, you know, first person POV as well.
Yeah.
That you miss out in the movies, I feel like. And I think they also, specifically Mockingjay, I think they took a lot of liberties away in the movie adaptation. Like, you get rid of Joanna's trauma with water.
Yeah.
And
that was a big one.
Yeah, and even her friendship with Katniss, you kind of gets
a little bit, but
little bit.
yeah.
And I think even Peeta's trauma, I just feel like the book just really goes into more depth there.
Yeah.
But I think the imagery of the movie does help show, like, I mean, literally Katniss in her outfit, seeing it and seeing, you know, the symbol of the Mockingjay pin and everything. And but what does that also say about, you know, consumers watching the movie? And like, we know Katniss is a reluctant symbol of the rebellion.
Yeah.
And I'm like, every time I'm like, oh my God, like, and I know that this is like Suzanne Collins' thing. It's like, we're the capital. Consuming this. And like, you know, shipping her and Peeta, or like, no, her and Gale.
But also, even thinking about like Mockingjay, when they first was like, I want to make you the symbol, so like dress her up, and they have to do a script and this, you know, all the CGI and editing for her. Like, it kind of resembles like we are taking the same tactics that the Capitol's doing to try to, you know, display this message. So it's like weird to see them like not just going and showing like, look at us being starved and bombed and whatever.
To make it.
You have to make some sort of entertainment aspect from it. Obviously, I know they stray from that, but it's just like, it's weird that that's their first instinct is to do that. It's making more of an entertainment kind of feel. Yeah.
Yes. Mockingjay was always going to be. Oh, no, go on.
No, please.
Yeah. No, please go on. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No,
we interrupt.
So like,
I was going to say, Mockingjay always felt like one of those books that was going to be extraordinarily difficult to adapt because so much of it is internal. And because movies are a visual medium, there's only so much that you can do to convey the level of trauma the characters are experiencing. Like, oh, we've already shot 5 minutes of Katniss in the fugue state. What do we do? But one thing that I've always very much admired about the way that Mockingjay goes about this is I think it does a very good job of contrasting the propos that Katniss is expected to film. I think just the simple fact, and obviously this is Collins, but the simple fact they're called propos is a very good indicator to the obvious, like a very nice flashing neon sign that, hey, isn't a solid, this isn't necessarily fair to Katniss. This is also technically a form of propaganda. But I think they do a very good job of balancing the propos with the reality of what Katniss is actually seeing and the way that reality is influencing her. So I've always really enjoyed that.
Yeah, beautifully said. Yeah. And I just want to say, like, there is a lot of, obviously, use of propaganda in these books and movies, the original trilogy. And I know that Sunrise on the Reaping, the big thing that the blanket message that we're kind of learning is going to be about Sunrise on the Reaping is the use of propaganda.
Yeah.
Right. So it's interesting that, like, we're using that idea specifically for Sunrise on the Reaping when it already is so prominent in the original trilogy.
Didn't we write down, I think there was something specific to Sunrise about that.
So propaganda So this is, a quote from Suzanne Collins. And she says, propaganda decides the outcome of the war. This is why Plutarch implements the airtime assault. He understands that whoever controls the airwaves controls the power. Like Snow, he's been waiting for Katniss because he needs a Spartacus to lead his campaign. There have been possible candidates like Finnick, but no one else has captured the imagination of the country like she has, end quote.
But it's so crazy how, like, I mean, even in real life, we rely so heavily on propaganda to get a message across on whichever side. So I think I like how she's putting kind of like a spotlight on, like, propaganda. Obviously we're making it way more the same with dressing up Katniss and, put all this makeup on her. And then also, the Panem, how they're, doing all the propaganda for Hunger Games and whatever. So it's weird, like, I wouldn't say weird, but it's just interesting how we're seeing,
like, both sides are using
propaganda, and how, like, I guess important would it be for them to get their messages across, or is the use of propaganda,
I think it's a very good way of highlighting that to these sorts of regimes, the most effective way of communicating a message is not through a person, it's through a symbol. And I think Mockingjay especially does a very good job of showing how a human being can be distorted into that.
Yes, exactly. Because, like, the thing that really gets everybody is when we see her, you see this, you burn with us, like, that whole thing was like, that's real, that's raw, that is what you should be showing, because that is real life, so it's just, like, crazy how propaganda is just trying to fluff up everything, but, like, no, show the raw thing, and that's what you're going to get across.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the use of symbolism in these books is so prevalent. I mean, you have the literal symbol of the Mockingjay pin. And then we find out, in Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes that there's a connection with the Mockingjays to Snow, to Lucy Gray, to Katniss, and even the use of the hanging song, or the hanging tree song. I have another quote from Argyle. So she said, quote, in the book Mockingjay, it appears in an intimate moment, Peeta, who's been tortured to madness with the Tracker Jacker serum, recalls Katniss's father singing it. It's a memory untouched by the serum and the first connection that doesn't trigger a mental meltdown. In the film, it becomes a rallying song for the rebels. Either way, it's a gift from Lucy Gray to Katniss. The origin story we see in Ballad explains the puzzle of the lyrics, how the dead man calls out for his love to flee to the gallows. That requires the Jabberjays who father the Mockingjays. After the war, they were released to die out, trashed essentially. Like District 12, they're throwaways, and because they're ignored and underestimated, they ultimately contribute to the capital's downfall.
That's a powerful quote.
Yeah. Right. And then you also have the names. And this is specifically Suzanne Collins and how she uses titles and names. and how the connections, like what they mean. So like you have Katniss, which is, we know, a plant.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so perfect because it, was a lake and like the potato thing. And I have something here. So Suzanne Collins was researching survival training and edible plants. And she found in one of her books a plant called the arrowhead plant. Okay. And then she read more about it. And the Latin name has the same roots as Sagittarius, the archer. And the edible tuber roots that she could gather and the arrowhead-shaped leaves were her defense. And the little white blossoms kept it in tradition with the other flower names that she had, like primrose and rue.
Yeah.
Like, crazy.
Wasn't there... Okay.
Okay.
Hear me out. Hear me out? I don't know.
Yeah.
So the same thing with symbolism. Mm-hmm. Okay, this goes over the whole entire series. Was the... was it 2 schools of thought?
Oh, yeah.
Locke and Hobbes. Hobbes and Locke. Like both of their what is it? Ethical,
like philosophy.
Because like who is which? Who is which?
I have it here.
I can't see.
Kelsey. Okay. So Hobbes' position was he believed that the state of nature was a state of war where people had no moral limits. And people should give up their freedom to an absolute sovereign. The sovereign and the government were identical. And then you have Locke's position, which believed that the state of nature was a state of peace, where people had natural rights to life, liberty, and property. People had natural rights to life, liberty, and property, which could be protected by an impartial government. People could form a commonwealth with an impartial government to resolve disputes.
So it also seems like the whole Hunger Games series is kind of, showing both sides of the Hobbes versus Locke. Because I know even for like Ballad, Songbirds, and Snakes, I'm pretty sure, we see Lucy with Locke's position, Coriolanus with Hobbes' position. So you see how those two, like how serious both of those come together, and it's such a drastic look into it,
Yeah. Yeah, so another quote from Suzanne, she says, the principal characters in Ballad embrace elements of the different philosophers' arguments and carry them into Panem. Gale passes Hobbes' basic worldview on to Coriolanus. Sejanus fights the good fight for Locke, as does Lucy Gray, who picks up the mantle for romanticism as well. Rousseau is lightly sprinkled over the covey, usually by way of his influence on the Romanticists, as he was an early one himself.
Hobbes and Locke, who do you agree with?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very obvious who Collins agrees with, and I think she's all the way. What I think is very interesting about the way that she explores Hobbes is that every character that firmly adheres to this philosophy somehow fails to acknowledge the fact the violence they use to justify it is all manufactured. You can't argue that it's evident of a state of nature because there is nothing natural about these states that produce the said violence. I think it's very fascinating, like this idea that in order to maintain control, in order to maintain the sense of authoritarianism, you need people to believe that the default state of human beings is brutal and savage and selfish and cruel. Because, while not to the same extremes, I do feel you see a significant amount of that in our modern world. You are encouraged to view other people as your enemy by default. And if not to that extreme, as people you should be suspicious of at best. And that's a very isolating way to perceive the world. Obviously, there are people you should be wary of. Obviously, there are bad actors. There are people that will hurt you if given the opportunity. But the majority of people are encouraged to adopt that as the default. And if you do not adopt that as the default, you are seen as stupid. Stupid, naive, childlike. When in reality, I feel it's quite the opposite. To assume that sort of cruelty in everyone around you is childlike. It's a very childlike fear.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. I think it's very interesting, though, especially with the way that Gale goes about it, because even in the scenario that she manufactures to attempt to prove Hobbes's theory that this default state
Mm-hmm.
is like kind of like cannibalism, you know?
Yeah.
There are still so many examples that reinforce the humanity of the tributes, despite her attempts to remove that. Even in the 10th games, where everything's stripped down to bare basics, you just have blunt objects. You have Lamina exposing herself in broad daylight to mercy kill Marcus. I think the way the movie conveys this scene is very touching because she like very gently like touches his hair, like it's like intended to be like a comforting gesture. And I believe in the books they have like a short conversation where she appears to be consoling him. You have Reaper like passionately guarding Dill. You have Reaper restoring a small aspect of the fallen tribute's humanity to them in burying them, even tributes that are shown to have previously attacked him. So none of those things are compatible with people that are purely attempting to ensure their own survival. A lot of these things are inconvenient. A lot of these things directly endanger the people that are doing them survival. So if this were truly the way that human beings were, the games would be over in minutes and hours, but they're not.
Because like they're forced into a situation where they have to, or they will, lose their families, or they'll be forced by, the environment, the games that they change, whatever. So it's like, yes, if you're putting us into a situation where you're kind of forcing us to have that violence or putting violence on top of us, like the snakes or whatever, like we'll end up leaning in towards that violence, but that doesn't mean we're lacking our humanity. We're lacking that like Locke's kind of POV where it's like, we all have our own rights. That's why I'm, mercy killing. That's why I'm, placing the flags over the dead bodies. Like, you can force us in that situation to try to prove your point, but then we're going to show you the complete opposite in that,
It reminds me, and I hate to even say the word aloud, it reminds me of alpha theory. The study that like alpha theory is based off of, the scientist that conducted it spent the rest of his life trying to undo the damage that he did, because that study has been used as like a metaphor for like how human beings interact with each other in terms of conflict. It's not an accurate study. So for anybody listening, my very crude summary, and I recommend you look this up on your own because it's been a minute. They wanted to study the social hierarchy of wolves. Wolves are family structured. They stay with their families for the brunt of their lives until they disperse to start families of their own. What they did was capture random wolves from random packs and shove them into a tiny enclosed space together, and then assumed that the extremely rigid social hierarchy that was enforced by violence and constant displays of dominance was accurate to the way that wolves behaved, but it wasn't. It was a bunch of terrified, frightened animals frantically attempting to assert some form of order with other animals they were not familiar with and could likely not communicate with smoothly. So it reminds me of that, just a manufactured scenario that reinforces the worst possible interpretation of humanity or how our communities are structured, and then treating that as gospel and using that as justification for other violent, harmful behaviors.
Exactly.
Right. Which literally is what's happening, because the districts themselves, they're not killing each other in their own districts like willy-nilly. Like they're being put in the environment that is forcing them to do this. And then on top of that, especially once Gale is involved and Coriolanus takes over the games and he transforms them into like what we see in the 74th and 75th Hunger Games. I mean, they're adding external things as well. So you have the snakes with Lucy, and then with Katniss you have
the fire
and the
fog. I mean, that's in Catching Fire, but
and then they're not wolves. You got me on wolves.
The mutations.
Yes, yeah, and it's like, I'm gonna try to survive. Like you're coming at me too now,
right? Because like now you're kind of proving like you put us all in here to all kill ourselves and show us like we're all evil, but like. But if we're not doing anything, we're just trying to survive. So you're like, well, I'm not gonna force things in here.
Exactly.
So like, you're literally proving our point.
Yeah.
Well,
and then on top of this, so you specifically have Peeta and Gale, who are also two separate sides of the war debate. So you have Gale, who, through his experiences, you know, he was less privileged than maybe Peeta was on the outside, you know. We know that Peeta was abused, but taking that at point blank here, Gale tends towards violent remedies, right? And Peeta, on the other hand, his natural inclination is towards diplomacy. And Katniss, that's her deciding factor of essentially who she ends up with. Like, I don't think it ever could have been Gale. Yeah. Because, right?
I think I think Gale, what I admire the most about how Gale is written is that he's written, and I know we make the Prim Reaper jokes all the time, but I feel Gale's actually written in a very sympathetic light. It is very understandable that he'd gravitate to this extreme. It is very understandable that he would want to violently dehumanize the people that he has seen physically, well, torment in every way a person can be tormented. Everyone he's ever loved, everyone he's ever interacted with. That is a very, very normal response. And some would argue completely justifiable. But I think Collins does an excellent job of showing that nothing is accomplished by deviating into this mindset. And so Katniss is faced with that choice. Do I want that retributional violence? Do I want that revenge? Or do I want the progress that ensures that something like this can never, ever happen again? And that's the reason it can never be Gale, because Peeta represents that future, that prospect of something better.
Yeah.
So, I also feel the books don't make this as much of a question as the movies do. Like,
no, for sure. No, absolutely.
Like, looking back, I was so surprised that the Peeta versus Gale debate was as big as it was, because I really don't feel it's that much of a debate in the books at all. It's more so the
like not at
philosophy. Like, it's like Katniss, she's like, do I want this violence or do I want diplomacy? And I feel it's interpreted as, do I want Gale or do I want Peeta?
Because I feel like there was no like evidence that she was going to be with Gale. It was more like if I had stayed in the district and just lived my life, like probably would have ended up with him just to, you know. But there was never any like Gale.
The way that she thinks about it is very pragmatic. There's not really a romance attached to it. She's not like, oh, I love the way that he makes me feel. He brings me so much joy. She's like, he's a good hunter, and he shall bring home plenty of game.
Like survival is her main thing. Prim and surviving. That is her main like baseline.
Right. And then I love this specific quote that Snow says specifically in the, I think it's both the book and movie, but I know definitely in the movie. Quote, "Why do we have a winner? Hope. It is the only thing stronger than fear. A little hope is effective. A lot of hope is dangerous. A spark is fine as long as it is contained." What do you guys think of that and how that kind of connects to what we've been talking about?
You can't completely crush a population's spirit, because you know how a wild animal is at its most dangerous when it's wounded?
Right.
A person is at their most dangerous when they have legitimately nothing left to lose. If you have a humongous population of people that have nothing to live for, that don't see any sort of value in preserving their own life, you have a very, very, very dangerous situation on your hands. So you have to give them just enough. You have to tease the prospect of something better on the horizon, but never deliver. You have to ensure that perhaps they've some tiny, small, petty joy to live for. I think of District 12, how they're allotted the black market, a certain degree of freedom that not all the other districts are provided, but you can assume that other districts have these narrow legal loopholes. Because, if you tighten the fist too much, you're just going to trigger that sort of resurgence, because if there is no point to adhering to if there's nothing to live for, then why adhere to the law?
Exactly.
But if you push things too far and that prospect seems like something actually within reach, that's when the situation becomes just as dangerous as it was if there was no hope whatsoever.
Yeah.
So my question then to you is, I think of Haymitch. Now, he lost everything.
Yeah.
His family, his girlfriend, they were all murdered by Snow once he got out of his games.
Yeah.
Because he did something that Snow didn't like, use the games against them, essentially. And, he turns to drinking and stuff. But he's essentially, we can say that he's lost everyone, right? He has nothing left to lose. Well, when Katniss and Peeta come around, Katniss kind of gives him a spark of hope, because I think that's, they get him off the drinking and he's actually being a mentor and getting back into like, I'm really helping you try to win this, and trying to gain sponsors for her. And it's specifically Katniss. Yeah, they're using Peeta as a chess piece in the game, right? But do you think that, Katniss was that little spark, but instead of it being like, that little spark is just right out of reach because like, oh, she still may die in the Hunger Games. And is it her survival of the games that makes it more than just that little hint and that little spark?
I think Katniss is truly like this perfect storm of factors. Like if we're looking at Haymitch, in Snow's ideal world, he would have executed Katniss and Peeta's families in identical fashions for the stunt they pulled. The only reason he was not able to do that is because of how public the act of Katniss volunteering for her sister was. If Katniss's name had been organically drawn, I've no doubt he wouldn't hesitate to axe the entire family. But he can't because of that social risk. So Katniss is very lucky in that regard. But I think in terms of her being that ultimate spark, there's so many points. And the fact that Seneca Crane fails to refute any of these points or prevent any of these instances from happening is a big portion of why Snow ultimately executes him, because he fails to reinforce the central message of the games. He fails to produce the appropriate political and social response, because Katniss gets away with openly caring for another tribute, a much more vulnerable tribute than she is from a district that she does not know. She gets away with burying that tribute. She gets away with multiple very open acts of defiance. Katniss is not a good actor, so I would imagine her affections towards Peeta, especially in those first games, seemed very clunky and inauthentic to him. And she also, again, the stunt with the berries. That I think, I can't remember if there's a line about this either in the movies or the books, but I believe like Snow says something along the lines of that he would have rather had them blasted with the cannons apart, like on the spot, than have the two of them survive. But that ultimately wasn't his call. So it's just through kind of like sheer luck that she makes it. But it's enough. It's like a perfect storm. So I think all those factors of contingency, like the fact that she prioritizes the life of her sister, she prioritizes the life of other people. She shows that solidarity between the districts is possible. And she figures out a way to outsmart the capital of their own game. That's that sort of perfect storm.
Well, then also going off like that Katniss is this perfect storm, and she really is, because you also have that one, she learned how to hunt. She can use a weapon, which most of the lower districts, not, the what are they called? The career districts, they've been trained for this. She knows how to use a weapon. Right. And she knows how to hunt and provide for herself. She knows how to swim because of the lake, which I don't think most people in other districts that aren't around water know how to swim, because we know that that's how Annie survived her games. Was she was the only one who knew how to swim. So you have all of these factors as well that literally helped her to survive the games in the first place as well. You know what I mean?
Yeah, when it was not supposed to be that way.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I also like this quote from Suzanne Collins. She says, quote, "If you look carefully at what happens in the arena, it's Katniss's compassionate choices that determine her survival. Taking on Rue as an ally results in Thresh sparing her life. Seeking out Peeta and caring for him when she discovers how badly wounded he is ultimately leads to her winning the games. She uses force only in self-defense or defense of a third party, including Cato's mercy killing in that. As the trilogy progresses, it becomes increasingly difficult to avoid the use of force because of overall violence is escalating with the war. The how and the why become harder to answer."
Yeah.
So, she's like a sympathetic winner, essentially. So the districts have this understanding that, it is very self-defense, and her caring for Rue and showing respect for this young
Because every year
girl.
they're not really seeing that, you know?
Yeah. And because it's more than just the norm, right? And then you have the Capitol, who they're seeing like the romance side of it. So I don't think they're really being influenced by this, but
Still.
But I think it's the district's perspective.
For sure. That's what's dangerous.
I think there is this like very powerful image of Katniss being established as a hunter that is being hunted throughout the entirety of the games and manages to outsmart the person that's doing that. Part of the reason that Katniss is an effective symbol in the first place is because she just survives. She doesn't prioritize like any sort of sense of glory. She doesn't ultimately just center her own life and like actively hunting down other tributes. And I think that's something that is very sympathetic to the average citizens of the district. And I think it's something that makes them recognize their own autonomy. And the fact that this sort of like extreme violence towards their allies isn't necessary. And it doesn't have to be that way.
Exactly.
And it's not always going to be that way the instant they're in close proximity to each other.
Again, there's that spark. There's that hope that they're like, oh, I want to, nurture this because there is evidence that this can be, the way of life, the way of thinking,
Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to just wrap this up with one last question is, what is your favorite book from the 4 that we have and also your favorite movie?
Favorite movie has always been Catching Fire.
Yes.
Somebody's going to pull up an interview of me saying that it's like the first one. It also
Don't go back.
Yeah, don't go back. Upon reflection, the first one is so nostalgic for me. It's the first PG-13 movie my parents ever let me see. But I feel like Catching Fire is just perfect. I feel the balance, the pacing. I think it's also from that much more effectively elaborates on the political aspect of the games, whereas I guess I feel the political messaging of the first is, I don't want to say subtle because there's nothing very subtle about the way this series is shot, but for lack of a better term, subtle. So that's my favorite movie. My favorite book changes often. I find like from the original trilogy, I'd say it's also probably Catching Fire, but in general, if I'm weighing in all 4, I'd say actually probably Ballad.
Oh, why?
Ballad, I think, provides a lot more insight into how this world came to be. I love the focus on the philosophical themes, but I also think it does a very, very effective job of showing how you can justify any cruelty towards a group of people through dehumanizing them. And I think it goes through like the steps and stages of dehumanization very effectively. Sorry, I have to cough for a second. One second. But I think it's a fascinating way to showcase like the transition of the games. It wasn't always something that capital citizenry kind of like chomped at the bit to see. The majority were disgusted by it. They thought it was tacky. They thought it was cruel. They thought it was revolting. And so to see how it evolves from a practice the majority of the population is against to something they actively root for and anticipate each year is fascinating to me. And I also think that it's very compelling to see Snow's sort of ascent to authoritarianism. Obviously, we don't see the full extent of it because he's always a student within the book, but I just really love the way that all those things are explored. And plus, I'm also a little bit biased because I have a copy of Ballad signed by Suzanne Collins, and it is my most prized possession.
Oh,
yeah. Yeah, I mean,
it sits on my coffee table like a shrine. Like,
yes. With the crystals around it and
like
lock and key
when someone comes over.
Yes.
No, that's not what happened.
My most prized possession. Yes.
Well, okay, so I agree that Catching Fire is definitely my favorite movie.
Same.
Although The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes also was
really good.
Incredible. I'm a huge Rachel Zegler
No, that's
fan.
your girl.
That's my girl. I love her, and I also hate her just because I want to be her.
Yeah.
And I want to be her best friend, and she's not. So Rachel Zegler,
whatever. Right.
She was so fashionable during that tour too. I loved like the constant references to the series.
Yes, it was
Excellent.
so
She
good.
understood the assignment. I loved it. And I just
Masterful.
love when you could see like that the actor has like a clear passion for what they're working on.
Yes.
Mm.
Thank you. You took the words right out of my mouth. Yes. So it is. I still think classically though, I would say Catching Fire.
Yeah.
And my first reaction is to also say Catching Fire for the book.
Mhm.
But like you bring up really good points about what makes ballads so good.
Mhm.
And I think another part that made ballads so interesting to me is we now know the origin story of the games themselves, which I know
of certain elements of the game as well. Like,
yeah, and like we didn't even really get into that, but like, oh my god, there's just so much to explore in this world. Like we could talk for like 3 days about this and still have more.
Yeah.
So I mean,
I also love seeing like Snow kind of toe that line between, you know, going down the path that he ultimately does and like Lucy could have changed him for the better. We like really see him toe the line until ultimately, you know, it's power and fame and all that kind of gets to him. But it's just like, oh, so cool to see. Yeah.
Well, what's your favorite movie and book?
Favorite movie? Catching Fire.
Catching Fire. Okay.
Favorite
Catching Fire.
Catching Fire. Favorite book? Yeah, I think same thing would be between Catching Fire and Ballad. I had really enjoyed the messages from both of them, the whole, you know, both returning, you know, all that and catching. So I don't have an exact one. It kind of goes back and forth.
Because and if you guys followed me before on TikTok, y'all know my actual ranking I put, Ballad was like towards the end. So like, don't quote me on that anymore either. Don't go back. Don't go back for any of us.
Ballad was very controversial when it came out. I don't think a lot of people remember that. It was a very controversial installation to the series.
I know people were so angry that it was Coriolanus Snow's POV.
Yeah.
People did not want that.
Right.
But like the use of his POV is what makes it so brilliant.
Yes.
Hot
I feel it's one of those things that's aged very, very well. I wonder if Sunrise will be received similarly. Like, maybe a bit more contentious at first, but I don't think so. But we'll see. We'll have to find out.
Yeah, we'll talk about this in part 2. So we'll see you guys. Don't forget to subscribe and notification button on so that you don't miss us chatting all about Sunrise on the Reaping. Coming soon. Yeah?